The year was 1862. The air across the American South was thick with the dust of marching feet and the grim inevitability of conflict. In what had been a quiet, prosperous corner of rural Virginia, the war felt like a distant threat until the guns of the Second Battle of Manassas roared to life, forever shattering the pastoral peace. It was on the fateful day following that brutal engagement, a day marked by pouring rain and the ceaseless groans of the wounded, that the stately Evergreen Manor was drafted into the Union cause. The manor, a sprawling Federalist structure with white columns and deep verandas, had belonged to the esteemed Sinclair family. Its owner, Mr. Jeremiah Sinclair, a reluctant but staunch Union sympathizer living in the Confederacy, watched in silent despair as Colonel Kincaid's infantry rolled onto his manicured grounds. With his family hastily evacuated north, the beautiful home, designed for Southern gentility, was summarily stripped of its elegance and converted into a makeshift field hospital. This was the moment of its grim transformation. A nation divided, a hospital born. The transition was immediate and jarring. Fine mahogany furniture was dragged out and replaced by rows of rough, blood-soaked cots. The grand ballroom, once the scene of dazzling cotillions, became the primary surgical theater, a brightly lit but brutally functional space where shattered limbs were routinely sacrificed to prevent death by infection. The sweet scent of gardenias and pipe smoke was obliterated by the acrid, metallic tang of blood, chloroform, and gangrene. The initial wave of casualties was overwhelming. Men from both the blue and the gray were brought in by the wagon load, their faces pale masks of shock and pain. Dr. Elias Thorne, a renowned Boston surgeon suddenly thrust into the raw chaos of battlefront medicine, barked orders with a grim efficiency that masked his horror. He understood that this hospital, born of division, was now the fragile meeting point of life and death for soldiers who, only days prior, had been trying to kill each other. Among the first staff was Nurse Eleanor Vance, a young woman who had volunteered from Ohio, driven by a powerful moral calling. That day she moved through the wards, her simple linen dress already stained, dispensing weak broth and even weaker comfort. She witnessed sights that would forever scar her memory. A boy no older than 17 crying for his mother, a seasoned sergeant whispering his final prayers, and the constant, rhythmic thud from the surgical room, the sound of severed bone hitting the discard bucket. No one, not Thorne, not Eleanor, nor the weary soldiers, could have known that the sheer volume of pain, fear, and unfinished lives concentrated in that manner on that fateful day would not simply pass. The trauma soaked into the very mortar and wood of Evergreen Manor. The blood that stained the pristine oak floors wasn't just a physical reminder of the war. It was the pigment of a haunting, the beginning of a grim historical tale where the spirits of the divided nation would forever wander the halls of the hospital that war had created. The manor was no longer just a building. It was a casket holding the collective sorrow of a newly united, yet deeply traumatized, nation. If the first day marked the hospital's forced inception, the days that followed were consumed by the frantic, gruesome business of converting the grand manor. Evergreen Manor, once a proud symbol of the Old South's leisurely opulence, was swiftly and brutally transformed. The goal was simple: turn a residence designed for comfort and celebration into a functional, if rudimentary, haven against death. The reality, however, was a relentless descent from Southern comfort to surgical chaos. The receiving line for the wounded stretched down the long, moss-covered drive. Colonel Kincaid's men, hardened by battle but clumsy in domestic demolition, were tasked with the conversion. They tore down velvet drapes to use as makeshift bandages, ripped up expensive oriental rugs to prevent men from slipping on bloody floors, and splintered antique tables to craft elevated platforms for surgeries. Every piece of history and refinement was sacrificed to the immediate, desperate need for medical space. The main receiving area was the two-story library, lined with bookshelves that still held works of poetry and philosophy. Now those books looked down upon rows of wounded men laid out like cordwood, their injuries starkly illuminated by hastily positioned kerosene lamps. The heavy scent of leather-bound volumes was replaced by the cloying sweetness of ether, a thin veil over the dominant, metallic stench of iron and infection. Upstairs, the beautifully appointed master suite, with its four-poster bed and delicate lace curtains, became the post-operative recovery room. The bed itself, deemed too large and cumbersome, was broken down and its parts used to splint legs. Yet a trace of the room's former life lingered, a faint, floral perfume that sometimes seemed to drift through the ward. a ghostly reminder of Mrs. Sinclair's vanity, tragically mingling with the smell of unwashed bodies and iodine. The worst transformation occurred in the grand ballroom. Dr. Thorne oversaw the installation of 3 surgical tables here. The polished, light wood floor meant for dancing was now permanently stained a deep, mottled brown red. This room, more than any other, epitomized the surgical chaos. It ran 24 hours a day. The light was harsh, the instruments were scarce, and the screams were constant. Thorne and his assistants worked with a desperate intensity, hacking and stitching, their white aprons quickly turning crimson. They fought against time, shock, and the limited medical knowledge of the era. The surgical debris piled up rapidly, piles of bloody rags, and the horrifying, sickening heap of amputated limbs growing outside the rear entrance. Nurse Eleanor Vance spent much of her time in the makeshift dispensary, which was once the pantry. She mixed foul-tasting tinctures and prepared dressings, often using boiled bedsheets in an attempt at sterilization that was often futile. She was haunted by the contrasts. The elegant wallpaper bearing scenes of classical mythology now peeling due to steam and grime. The servants' bells that occasionally rang, untouched in the dead of night, as if summoning long-gone help. The grand manor, stripped of its identity, became a living monument to the war's raw reality. The southern comfort was annihilated, replaced by the relentless, traumatic rhythm of surgical chaos. As the days bled into weeks, the building itself seemed to groan under the weight of the immense suffering within. The structure held the living and the dying, but it also began to hold something else, the imprint of the terror and despair that the hasty, desperate conversion had sealed within its very walls. More than the sight of blood or the sound of constant agony, it was the stench of war that became the defining, suffocating reality of Evergreen Manor. It was a dense, multi-layered odor that clung to everything, the clothes of the staff, the beams of the ceiling, and the very air the patients breathed. This horrific atmosphere was an immediate and visceral introduction to the medical horrors of the American Civil War. The core of the stench was the sweet, putrid smell of infection. Antiseptic practices were primitive. While Nurse Eleanor Vance dutifully boiled rags for dressings, the lack of understanding regarding germs meant that infections spread rapidly, turning minor wounds into fatal scourges. Gangrene, or hospital rot, was rampant. It carried a sickeningly heavy odor, a mix of decaying flesh and sour milk, so strong that it could induce nausea in even the most seasoned volunteer. Dr. Thorne often said he could diagnose a severe case of gas gangrene blindfolded, simply by the unmistakable, terrifying aroma that preceded its victim. Adding to this was the omnipresent scent of human waste and sweat, poorly contained in the crowded wards. The hospital's sanitation facilities were overwhelmed almost instantly, and the sickest men, too weak to move, lay in beds that were changed only when absolutely necessary. The smell of fear was also palpable, a sharp, coppery scent mixing with the sweat of men anticipating the surgeon's saw. In the surgical theater, the unique combination of odors was even more potent. Here, the pungent, choking scent of chloroform or ether provided temporary relief, but was quickly overpowered by the rich, metallic smell of fresh blood spilled onto the floor, followed by the burned meat smell of cauterization used to staunch the flow. Thorne's assistants learned to work through the thick fumes, their senses dulled by exhaustion and necessity, but the smell became an intrinsic part of their nightmares. Eleanor Vance found herself battling the odors with whatever she could find. She hung sprigs of mint and lavender, salvaged from the manor's abandoned gardens, hoping to provide some small, fragrant comfort. But the floral scents were merely faint whispers against the roaring, acrid breath of the hospital. She observed that the spirits of the men seemed to flag the most when the atmosphere was thickest, as if the very air they breathed was a toxic reminder of their imminent mortality. One morning, a load of wounded Confederates was brought in. They were not just physically broken, but starved, and their distinct, musty odor of deprivation mingled with the hospital's established bouquet of death. As Eleanor tended to a young soldier named Thomas, who was suffering from a catastrophic leg wound, she noticed something unusual. The putrid smell around him seemed localized, almost focused, yet his fever was inexplicably high. It was a smell that felt cold, she thought, a scent of profound, unnatural decay. Later, as Thomas succumbed to shock, the terrible, sweet odor around his cot seemed to intensify for a brief moment before fading, leaving a lingering, chilling residue. Eleanor would swear that in that instant, the physical stench of his mortal wound was replaced by a sharper, metaphysical odor, the smell of a soul departing, leaving behind a profound emptiness. The stench of war was not just a chemical reaction of disease and injury. In the haunted halls of Evergreen Manor, it became the heavy, inescapable presence of death itself. Dr. Elias Thorne, a man whose hands were accustomed to the meticulous precision of a Boston operating theater, now presided over what he grimly called the slaughterhouse, the hastily converted ballroom that served as his surgical bleeding ward. His subtitle was not just his job, but his relentless waking nightmare. Dr. Elias Thorne, the burden of the bleeding ward. Thorne was a man of logic and science, yet the scale of human carnage he faced defied all rational understanding. He worked 18-hour shifts, fueled by black coffee and sheer professional duty, operating by the flickering light of whale oil lamps. His surgical uniform was perpetually stiff with dried blood, and his face was a mask of perpetual exhaustion, the eyes betraying a deep, soul-weary anguish. The burden was twofold. First, the physical demands, the sheer number of compound fractures, gunshot wounds, and abdominal injuries that arrived hour after hour. Thorne was forced to make instantaneous, life-or-death decisions with minimal resources. Often, the only viable choice to save a life was amputation, a crude and horrifying procedure he performed with dreadful frequency. Each cut of the saw felt like a moral failure, a surrender to the brutality of the conflict. He kept a tally in his mind, not of the surgeries performed, but of the young men who had left the manor without a limb or worse, those who never left at all. His second, heavier burden was the psychological toll. Thorne, despite his hardened exterior, cared deeply. He remembered the faces of the soldiers, the terrified Union drummer boy who begged him not to cut off his arm, the proud Confederate officer who refused anesthetic, stoically enduring the operation. Every time he failed to save a life, he felt the icy grip of guilt, believing he could have done more, sterilized better, or worked faster. He saw himself less as a healer and more as a grim reaper, the man whose presence often preceded the ultimate finality. One foggy night, while resting for a mere hour on a hard-backed chair, Thorne was startled awake by a chilling sensation. He swore he felt a cold pressure on his shoulder. When he opened his eyes, the room was empty, save for the moans of the sleeping men. Yet he saw a faint, shimmering indentation on the edge of the operating table, as if someone, or something, invisible was resting there. He dismissed it as fatigue, but the feeling of being watched, judged, and perhaps accused never quite left him. He began to notice strange occurrences, almost always in the proximity of his surgical station. Tools would be moved. A faint, phantom smell of fresh-cut bone would linger even after the cleaning crew had thoroughly scrubbed the floor. Thorne initially believed the phenomena were caused by gases released from the infected wounds, but there was an intelligence to it, a sense of lingering presence that seemed focused on him. The reality was that the spirits of the men he had lost, those whose physical suffering he had ended but whose fear he had failed to alleviate, seemed tethered to the very place where their lives had been irrevocably changed. Dr. Elias Thorne carried the burden of the bleeding ward not just in the daylight, through his exhaustion and his responsibility, but in the oppressive, accusatory silence of the night, when the ghosts of his patients came to keep a silent, perpetual vigil over the man who had tried, and failed, to save them all. Amidst the despair of Evergreen Manor, where the air was thick with agony and the outlook perpetually grim, there was one constant, gentle presence, Nurse Eleanor Vance, a beacon of hope. While Dr. Thorne wrestled with the brutality of life and death in the operating room, Eleanor focused on the fragile thread of humanity that war sought to sever. She was a slight woman from Ohio, her hands small but incredibly strong, and her voice a soft contralto that rarely rose above a whisper. Yet her presence was more vital than any medicine. She understood that many of the men, Union and Confederate alike, were suffering not just from grievous physical wounds, but from profound loneliness and terror. Her mission was to treat the soul as much as the body. Eleanor was relentless in her care. She spent hours changing filthy dressings, her stomach churning, yet her expression never wavering. She fed the sickest spoonfuls of thin broth, talked to the delirious until they calmed, and most importantly, listened to the final confessions and whispered names of loved ones from those whose time was running out. She was the one who wrote letters home, carefully omitting the gruesome details while inserting reassurances of bravery and comfort. The soldiers adored her. To them, she was an angel who glided through the wards, her cap a small patch of pure white against the universal grayness. Her touch was cooling, her smile a rare gift that momentarily eclipsed the pain. She was the reminder that life outside the hospital still existed, that kindness was not dead, and that somewhere someone cared. But even Alina's spirit was tested by the manor's unique atmosphere. The spiritual weight of the hospital was heaviest in the quiet hours after midnight. One evening, while checking on the patients in the old drawing-room ward, she paused by a bed where a young soldier had died hours earlier, his body awaiting removal. As she adjusted the blanket, she felt a profound wave of cold pass through her. Not the cold of the drafty building, but a deep, bone-chilling cold that seemed to originate within the empty space above the cot. She looked up, convinced she saw a momentary distortion in the air. A fleeting shimmer of light that resolved itself into the vague outline of a man standing over the empty bed. He appeared to be holding something in his hands, staring down at the bed with a look of intense, quiet sorrow. Alina did not panic. Instead, she felt a wash of profound sympathy. "Are you looking for something, son?" she whispered, instinctively using the term she used for her living patients. The shape flickered and the coldness receded slightly. Though the entity made no sound, Alina distinctly felt a deep sadness, a sense of loss that transcended physical pain. She knew then that the manor's horrors extended beyond the living. Yet this spectral encounter did not drive her away. Instead, it cemented her purpose. Alina realized that her duty was not just to the breathing men, but perhaps also to those whose journeys had ended too soon. If these spirits remained because of some unfinished business or lingering pain, then perhaps her beacon of hope could extend even to them. A final, gentle comfort in the perpetual despair of their spectral existence. She quietly promised the unseen figure that she would continue to honor the sacrifice made in those blood-soaked halls. The conversion of Evergreen Manor was complete, and the routine of suffering had settled in, dulling the shock of the staff, but sharpening the awareness of the manor's intrinsic distress. It was during a particularly still, moonless night that the first omen of the hospital's haunting occurred, centered around a simple, heartbreaking sound. A soldier's plea echoes in the empty halls. The third floor of the manor, once the attic and servants' quarters, was used only for storing excess supplies, and the bodies of the recently deceased awaiting transport. It was a cavernous, dusty space, avoided by the staff due to its oppressive heat and the grim purpose it served. On this particular night, Dr. Thorne had finally retreated to his small, cramped office for a precious few hours of sleep. He was jarred awake around 2:00 a.m., not by the clamor of the main wards below, but by a sound that seemed to come from directly above him. A thin, reedy whisper. It was a voice undeniably human and full of unbearable misery, calling out in a ragged breath. "Water! I'm burning, please, water!" Thorne shot upright. His mind instantly went to the few men with raging fevers on the floor below, but the voice sounded weaker, more distant, and distinctly above him. He grabbed his kerosene lamp and hurried out. The halls of the second floor were silent save for the predictable snores and low moans of the patients. He ascended the narrow, creaking staircase to the third floor. As he stepped onto the landing, the cold hit him immediately, a stark contrast to the humid Virginia night. The voice was clearer here, vibrating in the dusty stillness. "Mama, the pain. I can't feel my legs." Thorne held the lamp high, casting swinging shadows across the stacks of bandages and empty stretchers. Logic dictated a new casualty had been mistakenly left up here, or perhaps a delirious man had wandered off the wards. But the voice had an unsettling quality. It lacked the heavy, wet sound of a living man struggling to speak. It was pure, distilled anguish. He searched every corner, pushing aside dusty tarps and checking behind stacks of wooden crates. He found nothing, absolutely no sign of a living soul. Yet as he stood near the large, broken window at the end of the hall, the plea intensified, seeming to come from the very air around him, close enough to raise the hairs on his arms. "It's so cold. They left me." The sound was not loud, but it resonated with a terrible clarity, a lament that filled the void of the empty halls. Thorne, a man who scoffed at superstition, felt a genuine chill of terror. He was not afraid of death, but this was something outside his medical reality. He was hearing the voice of someone who could not be there. He backed slowly toward the stairs, the lamp trembling in his hand. Just as he reached the landing, the whisper morphed into a single, heart-rending scream of sheer despair, followed by the faint sound of a thud, the kind of sound a body makes when it collapses. Then, abrupt silence. Thorne fled down the stairs, locking the third-floor door behind him. He didn't speak of it, but the experience marked him. He knew, deep in his rational surgeon's soul, that he had just heard the echo of a final, unheeded moment of suffering. The first omen was the realization that the manor held more than just the living. It held the ghost of a plea that, even in death, longed for relief, forever echoing the terror of being abandoned in the dark. The grand ballroom, hastily repurposed as the surgical ward, was the heart of Evergreen Manor's physical trauma. It was here, under the merciless glare of the kerosene lamps, that Dr. Thorne performed his gruesome duty. And it was here that the true tragedy of the war was sealed, resulting in the phenomenon of amputated souls, the lingering pain in the operating theater. The room's floor was stained beyond redemption, not just with blood, but with the indelible imprint of human agony. Every night after the living patients were settled and the staff retreated, the ballroom was supposed to become silent. But it rarely was. Eleanor Vance, often working late preparing supplies in the adjacent dispensary, began to feel an intense, localized pressure emanating from the surgical area. It wasn't the natural chill of the night, but a pervasive, almost physical coldness that seemed to concentrate around the 3 operating tables. One evening, Eleanor was sorting through instruments, saws, scalpels, and forceps, when she heard a faint, rhythmic scraping sound coming from the ballroom. It was slow and deliberate, like a heavy boot dragging across the wooden floor. She cautiously pushed open the heavy double doors. The room was illuminated only by the faint moonlight slicing through the tall windows. There was no one inside, yet the scraping sound persisted, accompanied by a sound she recognized with a sickening lurch. The soft, dull thud of a discarded limb hitting a canvas tarp. Eleanor walked toward the largest operating table, her heart pounding. The air was thick, heavy, and saturated with the phantom odor of carbolic acid and fresh blood, far stronger than any residue left from the day's work. As she approached the table, she saw nothing, but the residual coldness was overwhelming, centering on the area where a patient's limb would have been placed prior to the operation. Then she heard the whimpering. It was a stifled, broken cry, the sound of profound grief and loss. It wasn't the sound of a man in immediate pain, but of a man realizing the horrifying extent of his mutilation. "Who's there?" Eleanor whispered, clutching a lantern tight. The whimpering ceased, replaced by a deep, shuddering sigh that seemed to travel across the floor. Eleanor focused her lantern light on the ground near the table's leg. The light caught something, a clear, spectral shimmer, low to the floor, that instantly evaporated. But just before it vanished, she swore she saw the faint outline of a detached boot and an ankle, dissolving into the dust. The realization struck her with the force of a physical blow. The agony of the war was not just in the injuries, but in the final, brutal realization of being permanently incomplete. The ghosts here were not merely figures. They were echoes of profound loss. These were the amputated souls, the spirits of young men whose bodies had been tragically shortened, and whose spiritual selves remained tied to the physical remnants of their suffering. The lingering pain in the operating theater was the residual terror of those final, conscious moments when a man felt the saw cut through his bone, coupled with the heartbreaking grief of waking up to a permanent void. Eleanor understood that the theater was a loop, continually replaying the emotional trauma of being made less than whole. She left the room, pulling the doors shut, knowing that she had witnessed the deep sorrow of ghosts who were tethered to the manor, their spectral forms forever incomplete, forever reliving the moment they lost a part of themselves to the brutal logic of the Civil War. The most challenging hours at Evergreen Manor were the ones between midnight and dawn. It was the time of deepest cold, when fevers spiked and men slipped silently away. It was during these lonely watches that the staff began to report uncanny experiences, leading to the chilling realization that they were not alone in their duties. They were conducting the midnight rounds, encounters with the spectral caretakers. Nurse Eleanor Vance was particularly attuned to the shift in atmosphere during the dead of night. The natural sounds of the house, the creaks of the old wood, the sighing wind, were often punctuated by phenomena that defied easy explanation. On one such night, as she moved through the large parlor ward, lamp in hand, she noticed a flickering presence near the bedside of a severely injured Union soldier named Private Hayes. Hayes was too far gone to notice anything, his breathing shallow and rattling. But hovering slightly over him was a translucent figure. It wasn't menacing. In fact, it seemed to be performing a task. It was the form of a man in what looked like a faded, gray Confederate uniform, his face obscured by shadow. Eleanor froze, the lamplight catching the faint shimmer of the figure. The spectral soldier leaned over Hayes, and Eleanor distinctly saw a phantom hand reach out. It wasn't reaching for the man's throat, but for his forehead, as if checking his temperature. The moment the ethereal hand touched the living man, Hayes's fevered brow seemed to momentarily relax, and his shallow breathing eased slightly. The spectral soldier pulled his hand back, and then, incredibly, Alina saw the figure adjust the blanket on Hayes's cot, tucking the edge neatly around his shoulder. It was an act of profound, tender care. Alina realized with a jolt that this was not a malevolent ghost. This was a soldier, perhaps one who had died in this very bed, compelled by an unfinished mission of camaraderie or compassion. He was one of the spectral caretakers, eternally bound to the bedside, continuing his duty in the only way he knew how. Similar sightings were soon corroborated. Dr. Thorne, fighting to stay awake in his office, swore he often heard the faint, rhythmic sound of heavy boots patrolling the halls, a sound too regular and too soft to be a living sentry. He even found, on several occasions, that a bandage had been neatly re-rolled or an empty water pitcher replaced near the door, tasks he knew he had not done, and which no orderly would attempt at that hour. The most poignant encounter involved a shadow that frequently hovered near the dispensary, often moving bottles and jars with a faint clinking sound. Alina finally recognized the faint, outdated uniform. It was the ghost of a matronly woman, perhaps the manor's former mistress or an earlier, forgotten nurse. She seemed to be eternally ensuring that the medicines were stocked and ready. These entities were not looking to harm, they were participating. The men who had died in those beds, the nurses who had collapsed from exhaustion, the manor's owners whose home had been violated. They were all trapped, yet compelled to continue the work of tending and patrolling. During the midnight rounds, the living staff and the spectral staff shared the same goal: to alleviate the suffering of the soldiers. The living performed their duties with finite energy, the spectral with eternal, sorrowful dedication. The manor was a collective institution, run by the weary living and the compassionate dead, ensuring that no man, even in the deepest despair of the night, felt truly alone. While the majority of patients at Evergreen Manor were soldiers, the fringes of the war sometimes brought in civilians, refugees, wounded farm hands, and tragically injured children. The manor's smallest bedroom, intended for guests and located off the main hallway, was eventually designated the children's ward. This room, meant to harbor recovery, became the saddest corner of the hospital, a shrine to innocence lost and spirits left behind. The physical wounds of the children were often less dramatic than the soldiers: burns from stray shells, accidents from scavenging for food, or sickness brought on by exposure. But their spiritual wounds were far deeper. They were witnesses to unimaginable violence, their youthful optimism crushed under the heel of conflict. Nurse Alina Vance spent extra time in this ward, often bringing in small comforts: smooth river stones, a battered rag doll she'd found, or a piece of peppermint candy. It was in this small, sun-dappled room that the manor's haunting took its most heartbreaking form. The children, fragile and close to the veil between worlds, were the first to speak of the others. They didn't speak of ghosts in fearful terms, but as fellow inhabitants of the room. A small boy named Billy, recovering from a fever, often giggled while looking at an empty corner. "The girl in the blue dress is playing with my ball," he whispered to Alina one afternoon. "She misses her brother." Alina would follow his gaze and find nothing, but the air in that corner felt noticeably cooler, and sometimes a faint, sweet smell of chamomile like an herbal rinse would linger. The most persistent haunting involved a crib. Since babies were rare, the crib was used for smaller supplies. Yet staff often found the small rocker gently swaying on its own, sometimes accompanied by the soft, rhythmic sound of a child humming an outdated lullaby. One night, an orderly swore he saw a small, pale hand resting on the wooden rail before it vanished. Alina herself had her most profound experience in the children's ward. While sitting watch over a little girl named Martha, who was suffering from pneumonia, Alina began to feel a familiar, mournful sadness settle over her, far heavier than her usual exhaustion. She closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them, she saw it. A small girl, no older than 5, with long, dark braids, sitting quietly on the foot of Martha's bed. The ghostly child wasn't looking at Alina, but at Martha. The spectral girl's face was etched with a sorrow far too deep for her age. She reached out a translucent hand toward Martha's head, and just as the spectral caretakers had done for the soldiers, she paused. Then she slowly pulled her hand back, her face a picture of utter defeat. It was the face of a child who knew she couldn't heal, only watch. The chilling truth dawned on Alina. The children who perished in this room, victims of a war they didn't fight, were trapped here, still looking for their parents, their games, and their futures. They were spirits left behind, forced to watch other children suffer, eternally reminded of their own snatched lives. The children's ward was a place where innocence lost echoed not in terrible screams, but in quiet, heartbreaking sorrow. The gentle, lingering sound of a crib that rocks itself, mourning its own lost occupant. Nurse Alina Vance's experiences with the spectral caretakers and the sorrowful children solidified her belief that the manor was actively haunted. Driven by a desire to understand the root of the unrest, she began to search the older, unused sections of the house during her limited rest periods. Her persistence paid off, leading to Alina's discovery, a cryptic journal detailing unrest. The discovery was made deep within the original master bedroom, the recovery ward. While reorganizing a stack of blankets in a built-in window seat, Alina noticed a loose floorboard. Curiosity overcoming caution, she pried it up with the blunt end of a dressing knife. Inside the dusty, narrow cavity lay a single leather-bound volume, yellowed with age. It was a personal journal, dated from the years preceding the war, authored by Mrs. Eliza Sinclair, the manor's former mistress. The early entries chronicled the typical life of Southern gentry, balls, garden parties, and complaints about the humidity. But as the war drew closer, the tone shifted dramatically, detailing not just the political turbulence, but a rising, personal terror. Mrs. Sinclair wrote about strange occurrences long before the manor became a hospital. She spoke of unexplained cold spots, objects moving, and a persistent, shuffling noise from the third floor, the same floor where Dr. Thorne had heard the soldiers' plea. One entry, dated 1859, was particularly unnerving. The unsettling presence is growing stronger. Jeremiah insists it is drafts, but I know it is not. Last night I saw the figure of a very tall man, gray and translucent, standing by the hearth. He was not looking at me but down at the floor as if guarding something buried. He radiates profound sadness. I believe this ground, this home, was never truly blessed. There is a deep, agonizing wrong here that was committed long before we arrived. The entry offered a chilling new perspective. The haunting wasn't solely the result of the Civil War's tragedy. The war had merely activated or amplified a pre-existing spiritual anomaly. The manor was built on a foundation of sorrow. Alina read further, tracing Mrs. Sinclair's growing fear until the last entry before the family's hurried evacuation. It screams now, not always loud, but a persistent, soul-deep cry that vibrates in the foundations. I have discovered that the old smokehouse foundation, where the soldiers are storing supplies, was once the site of a small, hidden burying ground used for unnamed tragedies. The poor souls there are not resting. I fear when the soldiers begin digging for their trenches, they will awaken a wrath far greater than any living man can conjure. The journal concluded abruptly, leaving Alina with a horrifying implication. The unrest was multifaceted. The fresh, raw pain of the fallen soldiers and an older, deeper, festering wound in the very soil of Evergreen Manor. The cryptic journal provided the terrifying link. The land itself was cursed, and the blood spilled during the war had simply fed the existing spiritual energy. Alina now knew that simply tending to the living was not enough. To bring true peace to the manor, she had to understand the original tragedy of the hidden burying ground Mrs. Sinclair had mentioned. The manor was not just a historical site of war trauma. It was an ancient, restless grave, and the ghosts of the Civil War were sharing the halls with much older, possibly angrier spirits left behind. Alina Vance's discovery of Mrs. Sinclair's journal, with its reference to older hauntings, only intensified her focus on the spirits of the Civil War. She became particularly focused on one figure, the ghost of the blue uniform, the spectral Union soldier who frequently appeared near the operating theater, radiating a profound, anxious sadness. Alina sensed his unrest was tied to something immediate and personal, a search for his final letter. This ghost was different from the spectral caretakers. He seemed lost, often pacing the narrow second-floor corridor, running his translucent hands along the walls as if feeling for a hidden recess. He was young, perhaps barely 20, and the phantom wound on his chest, where a bullet had torn through his coat, was chillingly clear. Alina believed he was Private Hayes, the young man whose breathing she had seen eased by the spectral Confederate earlier, suggesting a shared, tragic end. One afternoon, a box of old, discarded hospital supplies was being cleared from the hall closet near where the ghost often materialized. Inside, beneath mildewed blankets, Alina found a tattered haversack, the personal bag of a Union soldier. It had clearly been overlooked during the initial triage. A deep sense of intuition told her this belonged to the spectral soldier. She carefully opened the bag. Inside were a few dried biscuits, a rusty penknife, and a small, folded piece of paper, stained with what looked like dried mud and blood. It was a partially finished letter, addressed to my dearest Amelia. The letter read, "My dearest, the drums beat loud and the fighting is coming closer. I am well for now, but if the good Lord calls me home, I want you to know that every thought, every step is taken with your face in my mind. The promise we made under the oak tree, it is the shield that keeps me brave. I have tried to write this for days, Amelia, but fear steals the ink. I must send it, I must. If I don't survive this next skirmish, know that I searched for a way to tell you one last." The letter ended there, abruptly cut off by the blotch of dried blood. Elinor understood immediately. The young soldier had died before he could seal and send his final, vital message of love and farewell. His soul was tied to the manor, not by the pain of his physical wound, but by the agonizing incompleteness of his last duty as a husband and a man. He was relentlessly searching the walls, the floors, and the furniture, not for his life, but for the means to finish a search for his final letter. That night, Elinor sat quietly by the operating theater, holding the tattered letter. Around 1 a.m., the coldness descended, and the ghost of the blue uniform shimmered into view. He paced, agitated and sorrowful. "Private," Elinor whispered, her voice gentle. "I found it, your letter to Amelia." She held out the folded paper. The ghost paused, his head turning slowly towards the paper. As she watched, the anxiety radiating from him lessened. He approached, and his spectral hand passed right through hers. Yet, as the hand touched the paper, the light around the ghost intensified for a brief, glorious moment. Then, with a sound like a single, peaceful sigh carried on the wind, the ghost vanished. The next morning, the restless, searching coldness near the operating theater was gone. The ghost of the blue uniform had finally found peace, his message delivered, if only to a sympathetic heart. The peaceful departure of the ghost of the blue uniform offered Elinor a brief respite, but her mission to understand the manor's deeper curse remained. Guided by the disturbing final entry in Mrs. Sinclair's journal, she was driven to the root of the oldest, darkest secret, unmasking the trauma, the history of a mass grave on the grounds. The journal had cryptically pointed toward the old smokehouse foundation, an area now used by the Union quartermaster to store barrels of pickled beef. Elinor approached Dr. Thorne with her concerns, detailing the spectral activity and the former mistress's frantic writings. Thorne, still skeptical but no longer dismissive after his own encounter on the third floor, granted her permission to discreetly investigate the small, overgrown patch of land behind the structure. Armed with a small shovel and the vague journal directions, Elinor began to work. The soil was loose and strangely dark, stained with something that was not merely humus. After digging only a few feet, her shovel hit wood, but it was not the sturdy wood of a coffin. It was thin, warped, and rotten, like hastily assembled crate material. Carefully, Elinor cleared the earth. What she uncovered confirmed Mrs. Sinclair's terrified whispers. This was not a proper cemetery. It was a shallow, unmarked mass grave. Within the confined space, the earth held the remains of not just a few bodies, but a large number of individuals, haphazardly interred without dignity or religious ceremony. The tragic history, as Elinor later pieced together from local farmhands and scattered property records, began to emerge. Decades before the Civil War, the land had been owned by a harsh tobacco planter. This secluded spot was the final resting place for the plantation's enslaved people and indentured servants who had succumbed to disease, exhaustion, or punishment. They had been buried quickly and secretly to avoid official notice and to prevent the spread of illness. Their lives were overlooked, their deaths were erased. This profound historical injustice, a violation of human dignity and a desecration of the natural cycle of death and rest, was the source of the deep-seated spiritual trauma that Mrs. Sinclair had sensed. The spirits of the enslaved had never been at peace. They were bound to the soil, their suffering unacknowledged. The arrival of the Civil War, the conflict over the very freedom they had been denied, and the subsequent spilling of soldiers' blood on the same grounds had acted as a cataclysmic surge of psychic energy. It was as if the intense agony of the battlefield deaths had merged with the centuries of quiet, ignored suffering, creating a powerful spiritual maelstrom. The anguish of the soldiers and the silent, burning rage of the unburied were now one entity. Elinor stood over the uncovered grave, the realization washing over her. The manor's haunting was a tapestry of American sorrow. The spectral caretakers were the new, immediate victims, but the foundation of the horror was the oldest American sin. She understood now why the fear felt so heavy, so pervasive, and so angry. The ground itself was protesting, demanding acknowledgement for the souls buried beneath the smokehouse, the true, silent, and forgotten victims whose history had been brutally suppressed. Her next step was clear. She couldn't heal the manor's haunting with bandages and broths. She had to give the original occupants the dignity and peace that had been stolen from them. The atmosphere in Evergreen Manor had been tense for days following Alina's discovery of the mass grave. The air felt heavy and expectant, a stillness preceding a great upheaval. Then came the night of the storm, a violent tempest that ripped across Virginia, bringing with it a terrifying surge in paranormal activity. The electrical storm began just after midnight. The wind howled like 1,000 tormented souls, rattling the old windows and tearing at the loose shutters. The thunder was not just sound. It was a physical percussion that seemed to shake the very foundations of the manor, stirring the spirits within the building and the soil beneath. Inside, the normal moans and coughs of the living soldiers were drowned out by a cacophony of unnatural sounds. On the second floor, Nurse Alina and Dr. Thorne were fighting to keep the lamps lit and the water out when the first terrifying event occurred. A tall, heavy cabinet in the hall, used for storing clean linens, suddenly slid 3 feet across the polished wooden floor with a tremendous scraping sound, impacting the wall with a hollow thud. No one was near it. It simply moved on its own, driven by an unseen, powerful force. Immediately, the temperature dropped to an Arctic level in the main parlor ward. The oil lamps, despite being sheltered from the wind, began to flicker wildly, casting the room into strobe-like darkness and light. In the brief moments of clarity, the staff witnessed figures everywhere. They were not the gentle, spectral caretakers of previous nights. These were aggressive, agitated shadows, some in tattered blue and gray, others in older, simpler garments, all moving with frantic, purposeless energy. Dr. Thorne, usually immune to panic, saw a dark figure leaning over a sick soldier's bed. The living man began to seize, thrashing violently. Thorne rushed forward, yelling, "Get back!" As his arm passed through the spectral figure, he felt a sharp, intense cold, like plunging his hand into freezing water. The seizure stopped instantly as the entity vanished, but the soldier was left pale and weak, staring at the empty space with wide, terrified eyes. The children's ward was the worst affected. Alina ran in to find the room in utter chaos. The small crib was rocking violently, slamming against the wall repeatedly. The rag doll she had left for Billy was pinned against the ceiling by an invisible force, spinning rapidly. The sound of children weeping filled the room, not the living children, but a chorus of spectral cries, amplified by the storm's energy. The scent of ozone and something akin to burnt earth was overwhelming. Alina grabbed Martha and Billy, sheltering them beneath a heavy table. She realized the storm, with its raw electrical energy, was not just disturbing the ghosts. It was powering them, drawing the anguish of the mass grave up through the earth and into the structure. The building was vibrating with centuries of unreleased suffering. A voice, low and guttural, snarled from the operating theater, "You brought them here?" The surge in activity lasted nearly 30 minutes, ending as abruptly as it began when a massive lightning strike illuminated the entire property. In the blinding flash, Alina saw, for a fleeting second, the image of a dozen desperate, anguished faces superimposed on the wall of the parlor. Faces both Civil War era and centuries older, all unified in their suffering. When the lightning faded, the manor returned to its customary haunting. The wind died down to a manageable howl, and the paranormal surge receded. Alina and Thorne knew then that the haunting wasn't passive. It was volatile, tied to the land, and fiercely protective of its dark secrets, waiting for the next catalyst to unleash its full, terrifying power. The violence of the storm had been a clear message. The spirits of Evergreen Manor, particularly those buried in the unmarked grave, demanded acknowledgement. Shaken but resolute, Nurse Alina Vance knew that medical treatment was useless against this deep-seated spiritual wound. Her goal was no longer survival but remediation, finding peace. A simple act of remembrance brings temporary silence. The morning after the storm, Alina sought out Dr. Thorne. She didn't need him to believe in ghosts. She needed him to believe in dignity. She presented her evidence, the journal, the location of the unmarked grave, and the terrifying events of the night. Thorne, weary and unable to deny the recent phenomena, agreed to her radical plan, if only to restore order to his asylum. Eleanor gathered the surviving staff, both Union and Confederate wounded who were well enough to move, and they proceeded to the site of the mass grave behind the smokehouse. Under the hazy sunlight of the post-storm day, they worked not to exhume the remains but to properly mark the site. Eleanor spoke to the small, silent group. "We cannot know the names of those who rest here, but we know their suffering. Whether they were enslaved, impoverished, or simply forgotten, they died without the comfort of memory. We are here today to grant them that. Dr." Thorne, standing stiffly in his blood-stained coat, read a non-denominational prayer over the disturbed earth, a short benediction acknowledging the suffering and asking for rest. Eleanor then took a rough-hewn piece of oak wood, salvaged from the manor's wrecked fencing, and hammered it into the ground above the grave. She did not engrave names, but a simple, profound statement. ERECTED in remembrance of the unnamed souls who found no peace. May God grant THEM rest. The act itself was profoundly simple, yet monumental. It was the first time in perhaps a century that anyone had acknowledged the existence of the forgotten dead. As Thorne finished the prayer, and as the last stroke of the hammer secured the marker, an immediate and profound change settled over the grounds. The air, which had always felt heavy with pressure and cold, suddenly became lighter, fresher. The distant sounds of the manor, the random creaks and groans that usually felt ominous, now sounded like nothing more than an old house settling. Returning to the wards, Eleanor noticed the difference immediately. The surgical theater, which had been the epicenter of the amputated souls, was quiet. The constant, low hum of spiritual distress was gone. The children in the children's ward were sleeping soundly, and the crib remained motionless. Even the living patients seemed calmer. The tension in their faces eased as if a heavy weight had been lifted from the entire building. This quiet was not a cure. The sorrowful history of Evergreen Manor could never be entirely erased. But the simple, genuine act of remembrance had offered the oldest, angriest spirits the one thing they had been denied: recognition. They had been seen, their trauma acknowledged, and for the first time the manor experienced temporary silence. It was a fragile, hard-won peace, a pause in the endless cycle of suffering, granting Eleanor and the living a moment to breathe before the next chapter of the war. And the hauntings resumed. The brief, hard-won tranquility achieved by acknowledging the mass grave was a poignant reminder of the power of reconciliation. Yet, as the war dragged on, and the manor continued its grim function as a hospital, the spirits of the Civil War dead returned to their spectral vigil. This continuing presence forms the final chapter, explaining the legacy of loss, why the hospital's ghosts remain an American tale. Evergreen Manor was eventually closed shortly after Lee's surrender at Appomattox. Dr. Thorne returned to Boston, forever changed, unable to practice without the faint, metallic scent of blood lingering in his memory. Nurse Eleanor Vance, after ensuring the final wounded were transported, was the last to leave. As she locked the main doors, she looked back at the grand columns, no longer seeing a stately home, but a vast, silent monument to suffering. Though the living left, the manor never truly emptied. The spirits, now quieted by the memory of the acknowledgement, did not depart. They remained, not in violent torment, but in perpetual, sorrowful observation. The legacy of loss they embodied was too large, too central to the national identity, to simply fade away. The soldiers of the blue and gray continued their phantom patrols. They were the physical embodiments of the ultimate price paid for a nation's unity. They represented the collective grief of a generation, the young lives spent in the conflict over slavery, state rights, and the very definition of America. Their presence reminds every visitor that the American identity was forged in trauma, and the wounds of division run deep. The hospital's ghosts remain a uniquely American tale because the hauntings reflect the unresolved conflicts that define the country. The spectral caretakers, the nurses and doctors who continue their rounds, speak to the endless cycles of duty, sacrifice, and the moral imperative to heal, even when healing seems impossible. The gentle rocking of the crib in the children's ward embodies the innocent lives caught in the violence of political discord. Most profoundly, the manor's oldest, angriest ghosts, the enslaved buried in the mass grave, ensure that the tale is complete. They serve as a constant, silent corrective to any romanticized view of the Civil War era. Their spectral presence is the memory of the systemic injustice upon which the manor, and much of the nation, was built. They are the truth that the war was fought not just over borders, but over the fundamental value of human life. Decades passed. Evergreen Manor, occasionally restored and later abandoned, stood as a relic. Visitors reported cold spots, the faint smell of chloroform, and the chilling sound of a saw striking bone from the empty ballroom. They saw the soldier searching for his letter, and the nurse checking the fevered brow of an empty cot. These are not just simple ghost stories. They are manifestations of history, trapped by the intensity of their final moments. The legacy of loss at Evergreen Manor is the eternal echo of American history, a reminder that the great struggles for freedom, equality, and unity have always been terribly expensive. The spirits stand as the silent, eternal witnesses, ensuring that the cost of becoming one nation, indivisible, is never forgotten. They remain because the American soul itself is haunted by the loss they represent.